start rolling in.
With the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. Welcome to our webinar on low elevation basic glades. This is one of the habitat types in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and we're very proud to be able to share this information with you today. So we want to thank our webinar presenters, Josh Kelly. Josh is the public lands field biologist at MountainTrue, and he also serves on SAHC's Land Protection Committee. At MountainTrue, Josh monitors national forest management and logging and development issues on public lands, and he provides scientific information and guidance to promote ecological management and restoration. Josh is also involved in wild law, where he worked to promote ecological restoration as a paradigm in national forest management. Also want to welcome Sarah Sheeran. Sarah is SAHC's Stewardship Director, and she oversees our organization's program of monitoring and managing conservation lands and conservation easements, and she assists landowners with caring for their land. So we'll go ahead and get started and appreciate everyone's being here with us today to learn about low elevation basic glades.
Thanks, Carl, for that introduction. I'm going to get started with the presentation, and Sarah is going to join in the middle. Really do appreciate folks for coming out today and taking some time to learn about this special and underappreciated, in my opinion, habitat. So yeah, here we are looking out on a low elevation basic glade in the Craggy Mountains of Buncombe County. You can see just the grassland aspect of these habitats and the fantastic landscapes that they're in. You know, and to understand what a low elevation basic glade is, give you a little bit of the basics of community ecology. And community ecology is based on natural communities. Natural communities are groups of species, plants, animals, fungi, microbes, and the environment they occur in. And the idea is that natural communities, like species themselves, can be identified by their characteristics. And you know, some natural communities are one of a kind, but a lot of natural communities reoccur on the landscape in patterns that can be predicted based on the landform and the geology and other physical variables. So low elevation basic glades are a type of species-rich natural community associated with certain rock types in the Southern Blue Ridge Mountains, where we are. So low elevation basic glade is the name applied to these natural communities by the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. Interestingly, low elevation basic glades are not necessarily low in elevation, nor are they necessarily basic in the sense of pH. They may in fact be on the acidic side of things. You know, and they can go up to 4,000 feet or just above in elevation. But they're termed low elevation because the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program has a high elevation glade community that they recognize that occurs above 4,000 feet. So, you know, in a dichotomous world, this would be the low version. But to me, these are not necessarily low elevation communities. They tend to be associated with rock that is very hard. Talking about metamorphic rock that tends to have a lot of crystalline features, like veins of quartz and you know, other crystalline rock, and has a lot of magnesium, sometimes calcium, iron, and manganese. These are positively charged, you know, atoms basically, or form positively charged molecules that are termed basic. These are the bases in the low elevation basic glade. They are associated with not vertical rock, but with sloping rock. More so than vertical rock. This picture on the right is about as steep as a basic glade gets. Past that, you're looking at a cliff community. You know, and as far as the nomenclature goes, the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, basically, they call these mafic outcrop barrens. So, and ecological geeks sometimes argue about the difference between barrens and glades. And for instance, the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, which considers these a type of grassland, which I tend to agree with, says that barrens are sloping and glades tend to be flat. So Southeastern Grasslands Initiative would call these barrens, Virginia would call these barrens, North Carolina Natural Heritage Program calls these glades. To me, it doesn't really matter as long as we recognize that they're special communities and that they're distinct. And I just want to be clear here that we're not talking about granitic domes or any of the other many types of rock outcrops that you find. So this is, Table Rock, South Carolina, Looking Glass Rock, North Carolina, many of the domes around Highlands and Cashiers, North Carolina, Panthertown Valley. So these areas are much smoother rock and are much more acidic in their composition. So lots of heaths like rhododendron and mountain laurel, lots of pines. We're really talking about rich rock outcrops. They're much more associated with rich hardwood forests as opposed to pines along the margin. Very little rhododendron or mountain laurel around these. Very much grasslands over rock outcrops kind of communities. And the rock is very textured. So you see these garnets on this rock here. Also, in addition to providing texture, garnets are associated with that really intense metamorphism historically. So I think there's something to be said for how hard these rocks are as to why they form glade communities and don't form forests. Like I said, definitely grasslandy in their aspect. Big blue stem, little blue stem, various other grasses and sedges, loads of herbaceous diversity, great pollinator habitat. And so if you're out and about and you come across a rock outcrop, I'm going to take you on a tour of a lot of the plants that you might see in these places. And I'm a biologist that has focused on botany in my time as a biologist. So that's how I tend to relate to the world. So those are the things I'm going to show you as we go on a little tour. A couple of the really characteristic species of these outcrops are rock club moss, which forms mats on these outcrops. And this is a vascular plant, it's not a moss. So club moss is like shining club moss. Some people call it ground cedar or running cedar. These are vascular plants, but their common name, of course, is club moss. This particular one, Selaginella rupestris, is very characteristic of these glades. Blunt woodsia is a type of fern that you'll find in these outcrops. Another plant you'll see a lot in these outcrops is Cary saxifrage. Cary saxifrage, as opposed to say Michaux saxifrage, is much more associated with rich rock. And again, you can see here the highly textured rock. And look how there's a fissure in this photo where on the lower side of this fissure, you have a spring or a seep coming out. And these seeps add to a lot of diversity on these outcrops. So you can have very dry areas and very wet areas. This is a rock outcrop right outside of Asheville on private land, a fantastic one with very grassland aspect. But around the margin there of these, there's a lot of trees. And so ash trees are very associated with rock outcrops or these basic glades. And unfortunately, you can see that these ash trees are all dead due to the emerald ash borer beetle. And so invasive species like emerald ash borer beetle you're going to hear about are some of the biggest threats to these habitats. Another woody plant species that you'll find on some of these glades is eastern red cedar. And there's a whole unique subtype of this community, the cedar hardwood woodland that occurs on these. That's very rare and has unique moss and bryophyte species associated with it. So at times these can be very dry communities, and prickly pear cactus is an indicator of that dry condition, but also an indicator of the rich high base minerals that come out of these rocks. One of the moist site species that's more kind of typical of a rich cove forest that you'll see all over these is fernleaf phacelia, that purple flower. You also see Appalachian phacelia on these, that whiter colored phacelia species. Allegheny stonecrop is a very large stonecrop species that you'll find that's indicative of the richer kind of rock outcrop. And hawthorns are another woody plant species that you'll see in abundance, in particular in the Craggy Mountain versions of these glades. And I can't tell you what hawthorn species that is. I haven't perfected my hawthorn identification yet, but there's a lot of them out there. Beard tongue is a beautiful plant that you'll find on these glades. And this is the more common Penstemon canescens, that's kind of on the eastern end of the Blue Ridge. As you get closer to Tennessee, you'll find more of Small's beard tongue, Penstemon smallii, which is a pretty rare species. Flowering spurge is very abundant oftentimes in these glades. And you know, some taxonomists are thinking that this interesting form, you see the interesting geometry on this spurge, may be some undescribed variety of species of spurge. Again, that's above my pay grade, but for now, I would call this just a normal flowering spurge. Indian paintbrush, very charismatic species, and occurs on a handful of these that I've seen. One of the characteristics of these glades is that their composition varies a lot. So, you know, any individual glade may just have 50 to 75 species of herbaceous plants. But in total, you know, if you were to look at the hundreds of examples of these across the mountains, you would have hundreds of species of plants, if not over 1,000 species of vascular plant. So there's a tremendous variation, and really to conserve this type of habitat, you really need to conserve a lot of these sites because of that variation between them. Shooting star is a rare species that's tracked in North Carolina that is can be fairly abundant on these sites, especially higher elevation sites that have some seepage. Chauncey's coneflower is another pretty rare plant that is named, that's Rudbeckia triloba variety Beedleyi, and was first described, I believe, by people working out of the Biltmore estate years ago. But it's only found in a handful of counties in Western North Carolina and is extremely rare and occurs in these rock outcrops. Fameflower is one of the more charismatic little rock outcrop species that you'll find. This is a pretty small little plant, but very cool. You see the succulent round leaves, very adapted to drought. And then the flowers are just gorgeous, and they're really interesting in that they only open for a small window during the day, typically between about 2 and 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So you can kind of tell time by them when you're out there on the rock outcrop. If they're closed, you know it's not between 2 and 4 p.m. If they're open, it's, you know, mid-afternoon. And in the background there, you see a nice patch of the hairy lip fern, the genus Meropteris. Those lip ferns are very characteristic of these richer outcrops. Carolina lily is one of the species you'll find out here. And you know, Carolina lily you can find in a lot of different kinds of habitats, but they do great in these glades. If you are familiar with Turk's cap lily, you might say, well, how is that different than Turk's cap lily? Well, a couple ways. You can look at those leaves and see that they're broadest beyond the middle. That's the term spatulate, if you were to go through the key. So they have spatulate leaves. And their flowers are slightly different. You see how long those stamens are in comparison to the flower. Another rare species that's associated with these outcrops is Allegheny onion, especially in the Buncombe County Basic Glades. Allegheny onion is fairly abundant, but it's globally a very rare species, considered, you know, a G3 species known from less than 100 sites globally, and has those beautiful magenta flowers. A couple other unusual species you might be lucky enough to come across: Erebus adpressipilis, a plant so rare it doesn't have a common name. This is a mustard where the leaves are very adpressed to the stem. You see how the leaves kind of parallel the stem? That's called adpressed. It's got tiny little white flowers, and it does all its flowering in all its business before June, and pretty much wilts away by June. And it's known from just a handful of sites in North Carolina. It's very disjunct from the Midwest. The roundleaf serviceberry is a species of serviceberry with a round leaf and a fuzzy woolly underside of the leaf, and is also tracked in North Carolina on the watch list. Stone mountain mint, another tracked species that you'll find on some of these glades, has one of the characteristics of this mountain mint, as opposed to a lot of other mountain mints that have sort of a citronella smell. This one has a very nice kind of spearmint, kind of sweeter smell. It's one of the ways you can identify it. And Virginia wild rye is a very characteristic grass that you'll find on some of these outcrops. This is one of my favorite ones, the narrow-leaved milkweed. And I've only seen this on 2 of these outcrops, both on private land, both unprotected in Buncombe County. Much different than the other milkweeds in the mountains, much more common in the longleaf pine forest of the coastal plain. So again, grassland kind of affinity. these outcrops. A couple other species with white flowers you'll see on these glades: narrow-leaved mountain mint and branching draba. Branching draba is incredibly rare in North Carolina, known from fewer than 20 sites in the state. And again, I'm going to keep hitting the rare species here, moss phlox. Moss phlox is something that you'll see in people's yards, but that's not the same as these wild populations. Those have been brought into cultivation hundreds of years ago, actually taken over to Europe, developed in, I believe, at the Kew Gardens in England, and then brought into the horticultural trade. These wild populations of moss phlox are, again, very rare, usually associated with limestone, but we really don't have limestone in Western North Carolina. So this is an indicator of that cation-rich rock that these glades are associated with. And here is a little easy to overlook plant. It's a species of mustard in the genus Borodonia. It's currently lumped in with Borodonia livigata, but it's, North Carolina botanists are noticing that this is a very different plant. Al Radford actually called this Borodonia burkii, or at the time I think it was Erebus burkii. But this plant has much narrower leaves and it's very blue-green in color compared to Borodonia livigata, and occurs in very specialized habitat. Where Borodonia livigata is more generally just found in forests, rocky forests. This is very associated with open rock outcrops and very rich open rock outcrops. So this could be, just a undescribed species right in our backyard, which is kind of a trend you see, that there are a lot of species out there that are still being discovered and are new to science. And yeah, just a couple of years ago, I was exploring one of these glades and documented Buncombe County's first known population of glade blue crows. This is a species that's associated with limestone cedar glades, more common in central Tennessee. In North Carolina, it's just known from a handful of sites, several of them in the Piedmont on diabase barrens and glades around Durham, North Carolina, but also disjunct here in Buncombe County. And so this is known from only 3 of these outcrops, all in Buncombe County, all unprotected on private land. And that same year in 2018, I was exploring one of these sites on national forest land, Pisgah National Forest. I came across this little plant. And it looked like an aster to me. I didn't know what it was, but you notice that silky or that hairy kind of fuzzy vegetation has a very silky feel to it. I put this on Facebook and asked around what folks thought it was. And Alan Weekly, the director of the UNC Herbarium, said, well, the only thing that makes sense to me is Symphyotricum pratense, but it hasn't been seen in North Carolina in over a century. And so I went back that fall with Wes Knapp from the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, and we saw this gorgeous flower to go along with those silky leaves. And it turned out this is Symphyotricum pratense, at least for now. And this species hadn't been documented in North Carolina since 1816. It was last seen by Thomas Nuttall in his exploration of Western North Carolina when he came through in 1816. So it was a 200-year span that it had been seen. And this again may actually be better placed in its own unique taxon, because it's distinct from the rest of the range. It has many more ray flowers and disc flowers than other members of this species, and is quite disjunct from this, by far the easternmost population of this entity. I've talked a lot about plants, but there are a lot of very cool animals associated with these rock outcrops, especially reptiles. They're very snaky places, and I don't really like getting too up close and personal with copperheads, but they are pretty. Rattlesnakes I actually like a lot more. They're a lot calmer and tend to be much less aggressive than copperheads. And here you're looking at a whole pile of rattlesnakes in one of these outcrops in the Craggies. Probably what I was told is these are gravid females that are congregating to give birth to their live young, which happens early summer, late spring, early summer. And this is another very interesting animal. So on the top left, you can kind of see the habitat for this animal. And this occurs on other rock outcrops as well, but very characteristic of these glades. Top right, you can see this is the rock-loving grasshopper. You can see how it's very camouflaged with lichen. Very co-evolved with lichen-covered rocks. And then on the bottom left and the bottom right, there are grasshoppers in those photos, and you get extra points if you can pick those So take a moment to try to see that animal with its incredible camouflage, the incredible coevolution it has with lichen-colored rocks, lichen-covered rocks. I'll also just say that another really cool species that I tend to find associated with this habitat in the Craggies is the cerulean warbler. And I'm not sure if it's because of the rock outcrop and the opening there, or more just because of the rich soil. I suspect the latter that's associated with these, but there's a lot of cerulean warbler populations that I find around these rock outcrops. When you look at the distribution of these outcrops, they form sort of a linear band through the center of the Southern Blue Ridge, going from North Georgia up into North Carolina and kind of petering out around Yancey County, North Carolina. And there are some big concentrations of them in Macon and Jackson County, also in Buncombe County. Buncombe County has a big concentration, and all the photos I've shown you today are from the Craggy Mountain glades here in Buncombe County. And there are some really good examples on protected land like Pisgah National Forest and the Blue Ridge Parkway, but the majority of these and some of the very, very best of these are on unprotected private land, as you can see. The purple land being the conservation land, and the not purple land being private land, unprotected private land. So there's really a lot of work to be done if we are going to preserve the biodiversity that's associated with these rock outcrops. And these are very high biodiversity sites, and these have been long-term refugia for grassland species. There have been some pollen studies that indicate these sites have been very stable for perhaps millions of years, and have been long-term grassland islands in this sea of forest we get here in the Blue Ridge. And there are dozens of rare plant and animal species dependent on this habitat type. Based on analysis of aerial imagery, I estimate that there is approximately 3,500 acres of these community globally. So that's about, we're in a 9 million acre area in the Southern Blue Ridge. So that's like 0.04% of our landscape is in this habitat type, but a tremendous amount of the diversity. And as far as the total acreage, it compares, it's pretty similar to the total acreage of much more well-known natural communities like grassy balds. And while maybe not as unique as a grassy bald, these are probably more biodiverse because of their big geographic range and the variation between states. So I'll turn it over to Sarah now to talk about some of these fantastic sites that are on SAHC.
Thanks, Josh. That was really helpful. And I learned some new plants that I hadn't been familiar with. So SAHC has been fortunate to protect several properties that have considerable glade habitat on them. And while I could spend a whole presentation showing you all of those, I'm just going to feature a few of them here. I'm focusing on the area that Josh just mentioned, sort of in the Craggy Mountains here, near the Asheville watershed. And so we have two properties over here that we call Laurel Ridge. And over here is an example of a type of glade that occurs in that property. This is more than sloping, but not quite a cliff, as Josh pointed out. And it tends to be dominated, as you can see, by grasses and mosses. This is actually very wet due to seepage. So it's essentially like a mat of vegetation, a mix of vegetation over rock. This property is covered with this type of habitat, or I should say these islands within a forested property. If you go to the next slide, Josh, thank you for advancing for me. Might take a minute.
Yeah, actually, it's for some reason I am stuck right now on the advance. Let me see if I can somehow. I'm going to try stopping the share and resharing and see if that can.
Okay.
And I'm going to go ahead and advance all the way to where we were. Okay, there it worked.
Great. So I just wanted to feature too, there are several properties over here in the Craggy Mountains that had the eastern shooting star, the state listed species that Josh was referring to. I find it to sort of be all over this area. So these are just a few of the properties that it's featured, that this species occurs, but it really is sort of locally abundant on several of these other properties. And there's another property kind of to the south. Oh, someone can't see my face. I don't I'll try. That has a little bit of that cedar woodland habitat that Josh was also mentioning as being a subtype of these southern glade habitat, or these low elevation glade habitats. This photo too is also from our Laurel Ridge properties. You can see that this glade is a little different. It's not as steeply sloping, it's drier, and it doesn't have sort of those mats of vegetation that tend to slide off of those rocks. And it's very open with some small stunted trees sort of in the periphery of this this glade. Next slide.
Okay, it
Sorry,
happened again.
Josh. I wonder
Yeah,
if
I
it's...
think, yeah, it's a glitch. When I press the mute button, this happens. I'm gonna not mute myself. And I'm gonna do this again.
So slide 41. Great, Alexis. Thank you. So if you can see, this is that Laurel Ridge property. And what I've circled here, you can see on the ortho imagery, this is 2019 imagery produced by the state, these clear rock outcrops that are showing up. And so the photos that I've shown you of glade habitat on these properties are visual. They're visible in the aerial imagery as well. So that's just, I didn't circle all of them because they're just all of sort of along the ridge line of this property, below the ridge line. There's lots of this type of habitat. So we were over in Laurel Ridge. Now we're moving a little bit to the south and east of the Asheville watershed. This is SAHC's Brushy Knob property. This also features drier sort of glade habitat butted up against the sort of the Montreat area and the Black Mountain area. Again, stunted vegetation along the periphery, the perimeter of this open glade habitat, but still dominated largely by grass species and herbaceous species. I also just wanted to point out, we're looking at a potential land protection opportunity. Josh has actually been to this site, and this is another example of a glade habitat on a property that SAHC is looking to protect. And so when we're evaluating properties for protection, we're very much looking at these unique habitat types, which play important factors into the protection of a property. So now we're moving over to Haywood County. What I'm showing you here is this area kind of near the Rough Creek watershed. This is what we call SHC's Double Side Knob, what's in our French Broad River Valley focus area. This area is extensive in glade habitat. Unfortunately, most of the photos I have are of fall, so you know, a lot of the plants have senesced and we're not getting to see some of the blooms, but there's like a very rich band of this habitat all through this area. And this is just an example of one of those habitats on SHC's property. And the next slide, or the next photo, you can see here, some of you might know this as pink corydallis or rock harlequin. It was in abundance on this property. It's not a particularly rare plant, but it is very charismatic with its sort of really pretty pink showy blooms. And then I'll turn it back to Josh for a moment.
All right. That's very cool. I really want to see that double side knob site sometime, Sarah. I was telling Sarah that I think that's probably the second largest expanse of consolidated glade habitat in the Blue Ridge. It seems like it's around 80 acres. It's really impressive because a lot of these can be very small. They can be half an acre, 2-3 acres. So having an 80-acre expanse is pretty exciting. So here's a photo of a nice glade near the Blue Ridge Parkway, and you can see this isn't very steep, and the forest around it is about on the same slope as this outcrop. So why isn't this forested? And I think a big part of it is that this is a single plug of rock that doesn't have big cracks in it, that can't form soil. That's a really big part of it, and that lack of deep soil leads to several things. Drought stress being a big one. Exfoliation, this process of soil peeling off these areas. And historically fires, I think historically these habitats were more extensive because their margins would have been opened up quite a bit by fire. And it would probably not take a very frequent fire regime to keep these more open than they are today. And so what we see today is sort of their minimum size, I think. In some cases, they may still be shrinking. Won't talk a whole lot more about fire, but I do think that that's a really important, really important process that's missing on this landscape. So here's an example of drought stress. So here we're on a glade, and this is October. Actually, might even be just September, and it hasn't rained in a couple of weeks. And you can see the trees on the margin of the glade are already, kind of giving up for the season, even though trees elsewhere in the landscape are still green. Just shows you how dry these places can be when it's dry. Now, off in the distance, you can see another one. This is I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but this is just above the Blue Ridge Parkway. This is a glade on Blue Ridge Parkway property. And you can identify these from long distance just by, in the fall, seeing the trees starting to brown out. So when you're driving around, keep your eyes on the road, but if you happen to be at a stoplight or something, look up at the slopes, and you might see some of these. Exfoliation is this process where, when these are wet, these are very, very wet. When they're dry, they're very, very dry. And so you can see there's a ton, just loads of Solomon seal, if you know your plants, in this photo. That's like a Rich Cove plant growing on this rock outcrop. So they can support, prickly pear in one spot, and just a few feet over, you might have Solomon seal. So just loads of habitat diversity. But in heavy rainfall events, these mats kind of liquefy and they start to move, and oftentimes they'll roll up like a carpet, like you see in this photo. This is this process of exfoliation that prevents soil from ever getting very deep on these outcrops. And again, if there was more cracks and fissures in these outcrops, I think the soil would get a lot deeper. You'd have a lot more trees that could help hold the soil together. But because the rock is so hard, they're uncracked and they don't tend to accumulate deep soil. So there are a lot of threats to these habitats. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about some of the management needs.
Yeah, thank you. Because the threats to these glades help dictate the kind of management we do on SAHC-owned properties. So as with all forests and community types, non-native invasive species are ongoing threats, outcompeting native species, and even just sort of excluding natives because they become so dense. So what is featured here is, many of you may know, Oriental bittersweet, which is also likes those rich sites and does well and forms dense mats that prevent the native species from establishing and growing. So those are one of the threats, as with lots of unprotected land development, just eliminating a lot of potential habitat, especially on some of these high ridges where you see developments going up. And then, as Josh mentioned, the exclusion of fire, which helps to keep these particular habitats open. And so on SHC-owned lands, we haven't actually considered the idea of fire, but that's interesting and something to ponder. But we do quite a bit of non-native invasive species management to kind of keep those glades open. And it may be, even if you start to see some encroachment from some shrubs or trees, we could maybe consider doing some thinning to keep those open. But these are some of the things that we're contemplating when we're evaluating our properties, the threats to some of the natural elements on the property, and how we may go about managing them. I think your next slide shows here, Josh, in the foreground there, you're seeing a little bit of purple color. That's going to be Japanese spirea, which is really beautiful when it blooms, and lots of people have it planted in their yards, but it does really well in these sites. It also tends to like the richer soils, and then you can kind of see how it's encroaching and invading and kind of taking over this glade habitat here.
Yeah, and this is a very important glade on the Blue Ridge Parkway. In the background, you can see a whole swath of the, if you look at that purplish color back there, just taking over. This is a glade on Pisgah National Forest, and that's on the left. Sue Ritchie is the botanist for Pisgah National Forest, and that's Bob Gale, the ecologist for MountainTrue, my supervisor and coworker. And we have entered into an agreement with the U.S. Forest Service to do invasive species management on several of their rock outcrop habitats. And this is an example of one of them. And what we did here is, because there's so many a rare species, we assembled a volunteer team of experts. This year, you're looking at like 80 years combined experience in field biology and botany here, and got into the site and removed, a tremendous amount of Oriental bittersweet here. That was the bad one here, but also some multiflora rose. And if you are interested in volunteering like this, you can always look at the MountainTrue website. We have several events a year generally where we do some invasive species control, and we can use your help, especially if you are not afraid of heights, in this case with rock outcrops. I think we'll just close out with some nice landscape shots of some of these glades. You can see some of the diversity of the habitat types here. These lichen mats that you see on these are always really cool. And some of these sites, higher elevation and kind of east and north aspects can be very moist. And here you're just seeing loads of Biltmore sedge. This is a southern, that grass looks like a grass, that's Biltmore sedge, which is the restricted endemic, and the southern Blue Ridge has a very narrow range. And yeah, these are just stunning open grasslands. And I think we're can move on to some discussion if folks have any questions or topics they want to talk about.
Anybody who has a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A or into the chat, and either way we'll share that with Josh and Sarah. Thank you both so much for this presentation. It really does give a sense of how significant our mountains are in terms of biodiversity and kind of the diverse habitats that I had heard of, but I really didn't know kind of what all was there. So, and hearing about some of it being on private lands too does make me think that we need to kind of continue working on trying to protect these. So it does look like some questions are coming in, and I will try to share those. I guess the question is whether some of the species have been put into commercial usage, like in gardens.
Sarah, are you aware? I mean, beyond the moss phlox that I showed, I'm not aware of much commercial usage of the plants that are associated with these.
Yeah, not widespread commercial use. I have seen things like paintbrush, for instance, sold commercially. There's probably a handful of species, but I do think you're right, Josh. The moss phlox is probably the most common one. Yeah, of the other ones that you featured, I think those tend to be more natural.
I am somewhat concerned about some of these sites being a little bit exploited. I mean, I guess another one would be prickly pear you see in people's yards sometimes. I'm not sure if it's the same species that we have on these rock outcrops, or, prickly pear is pretty diverse genus, and it could be from just about anywhere, the stuff that you see in people's yards. And in fact, a lot of times I'm pretty sure they're not the ones from around here because they look a lot larger. Mm-hmm. Maybe a different colored flower, but some of the real charismatic species, particularly I would say that Barren silky aster that I showed that's so rare, I do worry about people trying to dig off some of these places. And, I know over the years at Roan Mountain, there's been a huge problem with people digging Gray's lily, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's value in keeping some of these sites rather low profile for that reason.
More questions coming in, whether there's any petroglyphs at these glade sites.
I haven't seen any.
I haven't seen any either. I was going to say, yeah, not on the ones that I've been to. I know there are some maybe in and around hot springs, but not on any of the glade habitats that SAHC has on its properties. Yeah,
and these metamorphic rock glades, the rock is so hard that wouldn't be the ideal kind for carving into. So my guess is that, yeah, you're going to see more, and even on the granitic rock, because it's finer grained and not quite as hard even as some of this stuff. And certainly sedimentary rock, like you'll see, like Sarah was mentioning around hot springs, much easier to carve into. Mm-hmm. Stuff.
So I want to get to a couple of questions that Alexis asked, and Josh, you may want to say a word or two about MountainTrue. I think Alexis was asking about MountainTrue, whether our organizations are doing volunteer events, and questions about how to get involved.
Yeah, MountainTrue does do a number of volunteer events, everything from river cleanups to water quality sampling to, like I mentioned, non-native invasive plant control. Admittedly, our volunteer events have been much more restricted during the pandemic. But it's always a good idea if you're interested in getting involved to go to our website and you can sign up to stay informed with events that are coming. And I appreciate your interest.
Yeah, same here. We occasionally have volunteer events around non-native invasive species management. Same reasons due to COVID, those have been scaled back. But again, you can go to SHC's website. From time to time, we'll post an opportunity.
And that was from Alexis. Yeah, that's mountaintrue.org. That's the website address.
There's a question that we could definitely have an entire webinar about, but generally techniques that we use for managing bittersweet.
I bet, Josh, we probably do similar things. I've worked with MountainTrue and Bob Gale a lot on the bittersweet. We do kind of a cut stem treatment. So you're cutting the vine very close to the ground, and we have little small low volume containers of herbicide that we dab on the cut stem so that the plant will uptake the herbicide and it'll kill the entire root system. Again, it's pretty low impact. I mean, you're really limiting the herbicide to just that stem.
Yeah, that's I think the most effective method for sure, Sarah. And the chemical is if anyone's interested, triclopyr is tends to be the most effective one for woody plants like bittersweet. And especially on these glades, you could pull invasive plants in some places off these glades, but those soil mats are so thin and so fragile and support so much other rare stuff that sometimes actually pulling is not the best thing. And I think on these glades is a spot where it's probably lower impact just to do cut stem.
Because you could inadvertently pull up some of the natives and rare plants.
Kind of related, we have a question of how could you do a controlled burn on one of these glades, given that they're rocky and steep?
Great question. So the rock outcrops themselves likely wouldn't burn because rock is a great fire break. The margins of them would, which tend to also be quite rocky. The margins that have become, some of these you can see, like a margin of younger trees along the edge that are quite small. And those are the kind of things that would be thinned out around the margins of those glades by fire. And so the controlled burn would be the area surrounding these outcrops, not the outcrops themselves.
Cool. I think that may be all the questions that have been asked so far. People may trail in with a few more, but again,
it looks like there's a question, Carl. Is there a plant list for some of the Blue Ridge Parkway balls that a hiker can access? I don't think so. Josh, I don't know if you know of any plant lists for balls on Blue Ridge Parkway that would be publicized.
I don't. What I would say is, though, you can do a little reading. I would recommend a couple of sources. One would be The Plant Communities of the Southern Appalachians and Piedmont by Timothy Spira, which is a great book on local plant communities. And he has species lists or common species for all the communities. Another more scientific source would be the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, ncnhp.org. On their website, they have a list of they have a document called The Fourth Approximation of the Natural Communities of North Carolina. And they have descriptions of these community types, including common species that you might find in those communities.
I find the Spira book that you mentioned to be more accessible. So for folks who may not be plant nerds or plant enthusiasts, the Natural Community book is very accessible. For those of you who want to take a deeper dive, then the approximation is for you. It's mostly Latin names.
Good point.
Well, again, we want to thank everybody who's participated in this today. It really is energizing to learn about the landscape and then think about the kind of work ahead of us to try to conserve those sites that aren't already conserved. I do want to give a plug for our YouTube channel that has some of these lunch and learns from the past that have been given already, and you can go back and watch them again, and then we'll have a series of more lunch and learns to come. But for today, I think we really want to thank Josh and Sarah for sharing their knowledge with us. It's been a great presentation, and we're grateful to you. Any last questions from folks, or I think maybe we're kind of coming to the end. Any final thoughts from y'all, Josh or Sarah?
I just want to appreciate the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy for being the organization that is saving these kinds of habitats and helping private landowners conserve them. So thanks so much.
And back at you, Josh, for helping us find these sites, because you're bringing some of these properties to us based on your own local knowledge. So thank you to MountainTrue.
Right. It's mutually beneficial. We really couldn't do the work we do without the guidance for the places that are of the highest value. So thank you. Well, yay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you again for the next one down the road.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day,
Take
everybody.
care.